Amen. Thank you, worship band, for leading us this morning in praising the Lord and singing to Him. And so good to come in together and just sing and worship the Lord with our church family together this morning. I want to just mention a couple things to you today, just to be aware of some things that are going on in the next couple weeks in the life of our church, just so you'll be able to participate in these as you're able. Tonight is a sort of special night for us over in the Family Life Center because we're going to have a new member social to welcome our new members that joined our church a few weeks ago, and also to welcome back Pastor Dan. He and his wife Connie are here with us in the service this morning, and he has come back on staff recently to lead our traditional worship and serve in assisting and directing some visitation in our church, and so we're going to be welcoming him back tonight as well. So Finger Food Fellowship tonight at 6, and so hope you can be here over in the Family Life Center, and I want to encourage you to be a part of that. And then also this week we've got some very special things going on as well, opportunities for you to get involved and serve and be a part of the mission of our church to try to serve others in our community and advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. And a couple ways you can help with that is we do have these bins up on stage here. We also have some out in the lobby. We have some down front in the children's ministry wing as you come in there. But what this is coming up August 23rd, not this coming week, but next week, we are doing a Teacher Appreciation Luncheon. It's the 17th Annual Teacher Appreciation Luncheon, and one of the things we do, we feed teachers and staff that are a part of the public schools. Last year, we fed around 500 for that, and so we're excited about that coming up this year again. But we also like to give those teachers school supplies they can take back to their rooms and use to give to meet some of the needs of the students, and so we ask you to participate and join in serving in that by bringing some of those school supplies in. So you need to bring those in by the 22nd of August, and so I want to encourage you to be doing that over the next week and a half or so. And then also we've got our Kids Helping Kids, where we're going to be going out and feeding kids in our community this coming week and going into next week. And so we still need some help with that. If you can help, please see Karen Apple. That is a great ministry that we've talked about a little bit, and we're excited to see those things happen this coming week and next. And so be in prayer for that ministry as well, and we certainly still need some help. You will be a real blessing to others if you'll come and serve in this, and there are different ways you can do that. Talk to Karen about that, but also you'll be blessed by it, I know, if you can come and help. And then one other thing I want to just mention, all right, next Sunday night we have a special thing going on as well, all right? So this Sunday night, special thing, next Sunday night, special thing as well, because we're going to do a housewarming get-together finger food fellowship in the Family Life Center next Sunday night, August 19th. That's a housewarming event for Dan and Tasha and their family as they just recently moved into their new home there in Reedy Fork, and we are excited for them, but we want to sort of shower them. And so the way that you can help us with that, I mean, they moved all the way across the country to come over here to be with us. And we are excited that they're here, right? And we are glad that they are here. I am so thankful to have him here, and he is really helping shoulder the burden of the pastoral ministry here at our church, doing a great job with our youth and with leading worship in this service, and we're glad to have him here. But it's been really stressful. Imagine leaving your family and coming all the way over here, and so this is our opportunity to really help them and support them as a church family. And so they are requesting gift cards from certain places, and there's a list of those stores out there in the lobby on the countertop. So please wrap your arms around them during this event. Prepare to be with us next Sunday night for that, and bring some of those gift cards to help them and to just show them your love and support. All right, take your Bibles and turn to the book of James this morning, James chapter 5. James chapter 5 this morning. We are continuing, getting closer to the end of our series called Faith in Action. It's a series on the book of James. And we are in James chapter 5 this morning. Our plan is to finish this up next Sunday. In James chapter 5, we're going to be in verses 7 through 12 this morning. You've heard the phrase or the saying before, when you get to the end of your rope, do what? Tie a knot and what? Hold on. Tie a knot and hang on. I've titled the message, Hang in There. because this is what James has to say to us today. He's going to really encourage us to hang in there. Any of you, you don't have to raise your hands, but just think about this. You ever gone through periods and times in life where in your obedience to Christ, in your following of Him, you experienced some difficulty? Things weren't always easy. You went through periods of stress and strife and suffering. And that's what James has to talk to us today about. And he wants to encourage us that when we go through these periods of suffering and struggle in the Christian life as followers of Jesus, that we hang in there. And he's going to encourage us to do that and show us what it looks like. What are the signs of those that do hang on, that do hang in there? So just look at James chapter 5. We're just going to read through it. He says, verse 7, Be patient, therefore, brothers. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. He's just repeated something twice here in just a few lines, and that is be patient. I think he has something important to say about that to us today. He says, Be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. James has turned his attention in this section from last week. If you've been tracking with us in this and you were here last week, he has turned his attention from last week where we focused on the rich, and now he is turning his attention to the poor. He's turned his attention from the non-believer to the Christian, from the oppressor to the oppressed. In the previous section that we looked at last week, James had some pretty scathing words to say to the non-Christian wealthy of his day that were extorting his Jewish Christian poor friends. Today, he has some soft words for his Jewish Christian friends who are suffering. And these are words for us, too, to encourage us to hang in there when we go through suffering. There's some key statements in this text that if you just kind of reading through there, you make note of these and they come out to you. And these are sort of the key statements that makes it simple for us to put together the message that he has to say to us in the text today. He encourages us to be patient, and he kind of repeats this twice, and he talks about the coming of the Lord. That's important. He encourages us to hang on, to wait, to hang in there until the coming of the Lord, to patiently wait on His return. And to, while we do that, establish our hearts, like strengthen ourselves, be steadfast, be firm in this, that we are waiting for Christ to return, and to not grumble against one another in the process, and not to swear by any other oath, by heaven or earth or any other oath. And so we take these things and we put it together, but just to give you a little backdrop on this, there's sort of a literary technique that James uses in this section that we refer to as a chiastic A-B pattern. This is just a little backdrop into the study, but it makes it clear when we look at the outline today how we arrived at this. Basically, James uses this A-B pattern where the A's are grouped together to encourage us to wait patiently on the return of Christ, and then the B's encourage us to see how, to what are the signs that we can show our patience to others. And so really in this sort of pattern, James is saying wait patiently. He's saying hang in there through suffering. Mercy is coming. He's saying the Lord will return and all of life will be made right. And so he's encouraging us to wait patiently because mercy is coming and the Lord will return and justice is coming. When the Lord returns, justice and mercy will come. So we can hang on because we know that at some point the suffering will be ended. At some point, whatever mistreatment we would endure for Christ and the cause of Christ will be ended because the Lord will return. And that's the great equalizer of all the injustices that occur in the world. And mercy and justice will come. And here's how we demonstrate that. So remember, we've been talking about this is faith in action. And so James is a book where James says, don't just be hearers of the word, but be doers of the word. All right? And he says, if we have faith, we will have works. And so if we are truly in our heart, in our attitude before the Lord, waiting patiently, enduring strife and suffering and injustice, if we are enduring all of that, if we are being oppressed for the cause of Christ, and we are truly waiting patiently like James encourages us to do, it will be evidenced. We will show that in our life by those two things, not grumbling against other believers and not compromising our integrity in order to lessen the pressure. And so this is the direction that we're going to move as we work through the text this morning and the outline. He says, be patient, and he uses this illustration at the beginning in verse 7. Be patient, therefore, brothers, and you notice there the change and the shift in addressing the brothers and sisters in Christ. Be patient until the coming of the Lord. And here's the illustration. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains? He says, you also be patient. He says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit, being patient, waiting on the rain that God will send. Nearly every one of James' readers would have been farmers, or they would have known a farmer. I mean, agricultural work was just a part of everyday life. Today, most just go into a store and they find it growing on shelves in an air-conditioned building where they can just pick up what they want and they can look at it and they can just take it and leave. But in James' day, everyone would have either been accustomed to farming, to working the land to produce crops, or they would have known someone who did. It would have been ingrained in the fabric of everyday life. And in that part of the world, it would rain at two particular points of time in the year. They called it the early rains and the late rains. The early rains would come around October or November, right after the crops were sown. And so you may not know much about farming, but if you go put seeds in the ground, what does it take for those seeds to come up? Water. It takes water, rain. And sometimes, and if you've ever worked a garden or you've ever been involved in farming, you can water it, and that helps. But rain makes all the difference. I mean, it's totally different than putting water on it from a sprinkler. But what would happen is, right after the seeds were sown in that day, in that area of time, and in that region of the world, even today, October, November, after the crops were sown, there would the early rains would come. And then later in March or April, there would come late rains, which would help produce the growth that would lead to the harvest. Between these two periods of early rain and late rain, the farmer had to what? Wait. He had to do one other thing. What do you have to do when your crops are growing and you're waiting on the rain? You got to pull weeds. Yeah, you got to pull weeds. And so you got some things to do as well. But the farmer would plant the seed, and he would wait on the rain to come early so that it would cause the seed to germinate, sprout up, and grow. And he would pull the weeds, but he would have to wait till the later rains came in order to produce the fruit. There was really nothing he could do except keep the weeds out, but there was nothing he could do to speed up the growth of the plants or the vines in order to produce the harvest. He had to wait on God. Now, this is not just some secular analogy that James borrowed. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 11, where God said to Israel there, if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, I will give the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. God promised the people of Israel that he would send the early rains and the late rains. If they would be faithful to him, if they would remain steadfast and obedient to him, God said, I will send those rains. And so the regular rains were for the people of Israel, and James' readers would have been aware of this. The rains that God would send both early and late, they were a testimony of God's faithfulness. And just as God had repeatedly shown his faithfulness to the people by sending those rains, they could learn to trust him, so he tells them that they can trust that he will be faithful in bringing mercy and justice at the return of Christ. And that is the analogy that James is working to move into this. And so here's the first point for your outline this morning if you're following along on the back of the bulletin. This is what James wants to say to us, and I want to encourage you to think through today. Most of all, in the face of suffering, this is what James says. In the face of suffering, this is what we're to do. Wait patiently. Hang in there. Wait patiently. Hang in there, for mercy and justice are coming. James has been presenting his scathing warning to the non-Christian rich who were oppressing and extorting these poor Jewish Christians. And now he says to these poor Jewish Christians, you may be oppressed, you may suffer injustice, you may be suffering because you're a Jew and because you're a Christian. You may be going through all of this right now, but hang on, remain steadfast, remain faithful to Christ. In the face of suffering, you just wait patiently like the farmer. God has shown his faithfulness to the farmer in that he planted the seed and the rain came. And now he's got a period of time where he's waiting, but God would show his faithfulness again by sending the late rain. And you're in that period of waiting, and that's what you do. You wait patiently, establishing your heart, being steadfast, waiting on the coming of the Lord, because when that happens, and it will happen, because God is faithful and he has proven that to you, mercy and justice will come. Everybody say the word wait. Now, how many of you like to wait? Nobody? Nobody likes to wait? Go to the dentist office, sit in the waiting room a couple hours. Anybody like that? Nobody likes that? You would rather be in the dentist chair? Is that where you'd rather be? We don't like to wait. We struggle to wait. I mean, it's like, what is going on here? The drive-through line doesn't move fast enough for us, right? I mean, we just struggle. We struggle with waiting today. We don't like to wait. We want things to happen quickly. We get the food in the microwave, and it's like, hurry up. Why are the seconds taking so long? We just struggle today. We want everything quick. We want everything now. We send someone an email. They don't respond in 30 seconds. We're like, we got to text them to see if they got the email, and they don't get that. Well, I'm calling them, or I'm calling we want responses. We want things now. We don't like to wait. But James says, when you're going through suffering in this Christian life, what you're going to want out of it. You're going to want to just be done with it. You're going to want to get through that period. But James says we got to wait patiently. We got to wait patiently on the return of the Lord, because then all things will be made right. Justice will be brought to bear, and mercy will come. He says, be patient, stand firm, hang in there. The Lord's return is near. He says, the judge is standing at the door. And he says in verses 10 through 11 to sort of encourage us, he says, consider the prophets and Job. He says, look at that, verse 10. As an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. And then he tells us about Job. He uses these two things as examples to encourage us. You think about the prophets. We don't get into that quite as much today. We don't read that as much as we often should. Most of the time, if we've started our yearly long Bible reading, we've stopped long before we get to the reading of the prophets. I mean, we cut that out like several books prior to that, and we just stopped and gave up, and then we start again the next year, and we read the same few books every year, and we never get quite to the prophets. And we don't teach and we don't preach about that much, but when you look at the prophets in the nation of Israel were given messages by God to go and deliver to the people of Israel. And most of the time, those messages were not good messages. Most of the time, the prophets were not told, go tell the king and the nation that everything's going to be great and that, their wickedness and their evil, God's just going to overlook it. No, when the people were disobedient to God, God would come to the prophets and he would say, go and prophesy and tell the king, tell the people, judgment is coming. And so these prophets, in their obedience to God, would go and declare the message that God had told them to declare. And when somebody comes into the courtroom of the king and says, You're getting ready to be taken captivity by the Babylonians. Your wives are going to be taken as slaves. Your children are going to be taken as slaves. All the men are going to be killed. The kingdom is going to be destroyed. This is what God wanted me to tell you. How do you think that went over? Not very well. You take one example, Jeremiah. Jeremiah is oftentimes referred to as the weeping prophet. You take him as just one example of the patience and suffering that James is encouraging us to wait patiently under the midst of, to remain steadfast. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, he was told by God to do that very thing, to prophesy that the Lord was going to bring judgment on his people. He was told to proclaim the Babylonians would conquer and capture God's people, would lead them into slavery. You know what happened to Jeremiah for prophesying that? Being obedient to the Lord. His family betrayed him. He was beaten. He was put in stocks by a temple official. The king threw him in prison, threatened to take his own life. He was thrown into the bottom of a well that had little water in it, where it was just full of mud. And he was kind of left there for a period of time. Yet through all of it and much more, he waited patiently, and he hung in there, and he remained faithful to God through the process. We could look at all the others. We could look at several prophets. We could look at Daniel. We could look at Ezekiel. We could look at these other prophets, at the suffering that they went through for the cause of Christ. But this is what's key to what James says. He says, we can, look at that, as an example of suffering and patience, verse 10, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Now look at what he says in verse 11. Behold, like, here's the point. Look at that in verse 11. Behold, we consider those what? What is it? We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. That's the point. We look back at these prophets, we look back at the suffering that they went through for the cause of Christ, or for the cause of being obedient to God. We look at what these prophets went through in their obedience to God, and we consider them what? Blessed. We don't look back at their life and say, that had to be miserable. That had to be terrible. We look at that, and James readers who would have been steeped in all of the history of their nation as Jewish Christians, these Jews would have understood and been taught this and told these stories. They would have looked at the prophets as men who were obedient to God and endured suffering and in remaining steadfast. These were men and women who were blessed by God. And we consider them blessed for being faithful and remaining steadfast, for waiting patiently and hanging in there and being true to God. Then he goes on, though, and he goes to, after that, in verse 11, he says, you've heard of what? The steadfastness of who? Job. And in that, he tells us, you've seen the purposes of the Lord. You remember the story of Job? If you don't remember the story of Job, I'll just recap a little bit of that for you. Job was a wealthy, godly man, had a large family. He was honored. He was revered by his community. And Satan went to God because Job was a godly man, and he had all these things, and life was going well for him, but it says that he feared the Lord, and he hated evil. And so Satan goes to God, and he says, God, the only reason Job serves you and loves you and honors you and is faithful to you is because he has all these things that you've blessed him with. If you would let me take away some of the things that you have blessed him with, he will curse you. He will turn his back on you. So God says, okay, you can go and take things from Job. And so Satan goes and he takes things from Job. In one afternoon, from the attack of Satan, his flocks and all of his wealth disappeared. His flocks were stolen. His servants that tended to the flocks were killed by raiders. A tornado came through and took the life of all of his children. Job was shocked. He was stunned. He was in a daze. But you know what Job said? The Lord gave. That's what Job said. The Lord gave all of it. And he said, the Lord has taken it all away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So Satan said, that's not enough. I got to make it tougher. So he goes to God and says, let me touch him physically. Satan says, look, yeah, we may have taken away all the things, but he's still physically healthy. Of course he's going to be happy if he's still mentally and physically strong and healthy. Let me touch him physically. And so Satan attacks him with boils that blister his whole body from head to toe, takes away the physical health that he has. His wife, Job's own wife even then, tells him to just curse God and die. Job's friends come around him and accuse him of having some kind of hidden sin in his life. Like his friends come and say, Job, obviously you've got some kind of sin in your life. You wouldn't be going through suffering if you didn't have sin in your life. And so his friends say that to him, and he says, no. And this is what Job responds through all that, even the physical pain that he's going through now. He says this, though he slay me, though God take my life, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. Through it all, at one point, Job does begin to question God. He says, God, what's the point of all this? I haven't done anything to bring all of this on myself. Why am I going through all of this? And he questions God about it, and they have this long dialogue between God and Job in the book, and God basically responds to Job and says, I don't owe you any explanation. I am God. I am sovereign. I can do as I choose. And Job submits and says, of course you are. Of course you can. And he humbly submits to God. And what happens? What happens? What happens at the end of the story of Job? God restores everything to him. He gives him more children that bring delight to him. He doubles the financial worth that he had had before, bringing it all back to him. He gives him greater influence and honor in his community than he had even had before. He's allowed to live long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren born. And this is what James says to us about Job in James 5:11. We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. What is God saying? What is James saying to us? He's saying in the case of Job, you can see God's compassion and mercy. Now let me tell you, it doesn't always happen like that. You may go through suffering, you may experience loss in this life, and you don't always see God answer and bring all that back in this life. It doesn't always happen like it does in Job. But James is saying in the case of Job, you can actually see the purpose of God. You can see that even before his life was over, it was all restored back to him because God is compassionate and merciful. And because Job just hung in there, he waited patiently. He endured suffering. Yeah, he had periods and concerns and questions and doubts, and he asked God about those things. But through it all, at the end of it all, Job humbly submitted to God, and God restored it all. And James says, in Job's life, you can see the purpose of the Lord, how God is compassionate and merciful. So whatever mistreatment you go through in this life, listen, whatever suffering you go through in this life, whatever hardship you are facing, hang in there. Wait patiently. God is compassionate. God is merciful. God is a righteous judge. He will bring mercy. He will bring justice. If not in this life for you, certainly at the return of Christ in the next, mercy and justice will come through. So how do we know if we're doing this? I mean, if James says we got to wait patiently in the face of suffering, we got to hang in there, remain steadfast, how do we know we're doing it? He gives us these two signs of those that hang in there and wait patiently in the face of suffering. The first is those that do this, that wait patiently, that hang on, that remain steadfast in their faith. They don't complain about their treatment. They don't complain about their treatment. Verse 9, he encourages us here with this command, do not grumble against one another. When everything is going well, we tend to get along well with everyone. When things are going well, we get along. Mom and dad are having a good time with each other when they're staying within budget. Nobody's out spending too much money. Money's there, bank accounts rise, and everybody's good. Things are going well, we get along well with each other. But when difficulty comes, when suffering strikes, we easily begin to point fingers at others. We grumble against each other. In the church, when everything's going well, people are coming to faith in Christ. Everyone's attitudes are well. There's great unity. There's great teamwork. Things are moving forward, doing something for the Lord. Everybody's excited. Everybody's unified. Everybody loves everybody. Let some strife and turmoil and suffering come. Let some things come that don't quite go so well. What happens? Finger pointing starts. Grumbling begins. in our own lives personally, when we're being blessed, when we're seeing benefits and we're seeing the fruit and the results of walking with Christ and things seem to be going well, we seem to be okay, we seem to be excited. But then when our life starts to fall apart, sometimes we have a tendency to look at others and begin to point the finger and say, well, God, why do they get blessed and I have to go through this? Look at why are they experiencing all of this benefit in life when I'm suffering? And we begin to complain and grumble. You see it all the time with sports teams, right? Sports teams, when they're winning and the games are W's at the end, they're winning the games, everybody's good, teamwork's good, everybody's great, they're deferring to everybody, nobody's trying to take too much glory, but they start losing. What happens? Start pointing the finger, start blaming. And James says, here's a way you know you're waiting patiently in the face of suffering. Here's a way you know you're remaining steadfast. You're not complaining about your treatment. You're not looking at your life. You're not looking at the suffering that you're going through and saying, God, why am I suffering when they, and you're looking over at somebody else and saying, look at what's happened. They seem to be being blessed. Why am I suffering? So if you're waiting patiently on the Lord, you know that He is compassionate. You know that He is merciful. You know that He brings mercy. He brings justice. You know He'll settle the score. If we know that mercy is around the corner, we don't grumble against each other. We wait on His mercy and we remain steadfast in our faith. We don't look at others' situations and complain. They don't complain about their treatment. And secondly, they don't compromise the truth. They don't compromise the truth. This last verse in our text this morning, verse 12, says, above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so you may not fall under condemnation. This is one of those classic verses that has just been lifted right out of the text as if it was written all on its own and taken out of context and used to teach any number of things that are just not biblically true. This is written within the context of what James is talking about as he's writing to Christians who are suffering, who are being oppressed. And he's connecting it to this section with the connection above all. Do not swear. It's above all. It's part of what he's saying here. This is not a prohibition against making commitments. It's not a prohibition against swearing under oath or making a vow. Some people will take this and say, well, I can't go to court and swear under oath because the Bible says don't swear or make an oath. Some will say, well, I'm not going to enter into a marriage vow. I'm not going to make a vow to my spouse because that's making an oath. I mean, there's all kind of number of things that happen when people take this verse and just lift it right out of thin air, take it out of the context of what James is saying here. But what James is really saying here is those that are waiting patiently on the Lord, that are hanging in there in the face of suffering, they're not compromising the truth. They don't compromise the truth. In fact, Acts 2:30 tells us that God swears by an oath. 2 Corinthians 1:23, Paul called on God to be his witness that what he was writing was true. 2 Corinthians 1:23, Paul says, God as my witness will verify that what I'm writing to you is true. There are other occasions where this is proper and other cases where making commitments or oaths is not condemned or seen as wrong. Here, the context is for James readers who are facing exploitation and suffering under poor economic treatment due to their Jewish nationality and their faith in Jesus as Lord. They would face situations where they would be tempted to swear to something hastily in order to avoid a difficult situation. So remember, they're being oppressed. Their kids are not being treated fairly in their new communities. They're dispersed. They had to leave their hometown. They're trying to find residence in another place. They're being mistreated. They're being taken advantage of. They would be tempted to make a hasty commitment in order to avoid further oppression, a commitment in which they had no real intention of keeping. But those who wait patiently, knowing the return of Christ will bring mercy and justice, they don't compromise the truth in order to make life easier for them in the present. They don't compromise their integrity in order to make things easier for them. You ever been put in a situation like that where you're put on the spot and you feel the temptation to compromise what is really true in order to get out of the difficult situation you're in at the moment? Not maybe lying, but just being strong in your language to try to demonstrate to someone something in order to get out of the situation, to relieve what the situation is that you're in. Like I remember doing this specific thing back when I was in high school. After a basketball game one evening, we were at a restaurant, and we had this new guy on the team, young guy, freshman. It's kind of time to initiate this kid to the team, and you do all these crazy, dumb things. And so one guy thought it would be a good idea to put laxative in his drink. Now, it's not a good idea, all right? Anyway, so one of the guys put laxative in his drink. I didn't put the laxative in his drink. But he wasn't drinking his drink. Like, he didn't know it was in there, but he just wasn't drinking. So I was like, got to get him to drink it if it's going to be effective, right? So somehow I sat down and manipulated him into a bet that I could drink my drink faster than he could drink his, and he drank it, and, and then so he had, all right. Well, that was on like a Friday. Well, that weekend, the kid somehow got sick, and he goes into the hospital. And while he's in the hospital, his mom's like trying to figure out what's wrong, has anything happened? Well, he found out about this, because people just don't keep quiet when you do things like that. And so somebody told him what had happened to him. So he says, well, I don't know, unless it was maybe something to do with the laxative that the guys on the basketball team put in my drink Friday night after the game. So the principal of the school is now getting in on this, and she's calling individually people out into the hallway to, meet with her and to find out who did this. And I will never forget, she calls me out, and I'm nervous as all get out, because I'm like, by now I'm thinking, this is not good. The kid's in the hospital. So anyway, she says, Matt Smith, did you put laxative in Charles's drink at the restaurant after the game? I said, no, ma'am, I did not put laxative in his drink. I did not do that. Thank you. You can go. I went right back in. I was true. Was that true? Was that true? I did not put it in there. But was I manipulating the truth, avoiding the truth, not coming fully clean? Yes. Don't anybody, I'm sure I've already reaped what I've sown, so don't anybody get any ideas about being part of that, all right? But this is the idea, this is what James is saying, like in a situation, in a tense, hard situation where you're being confronted with something, you're being put under the gun and you're suffering and you're thinking, I could make things easier for me if I'm just strong in my language about this, or if I make some strong commitment here that I have really no intention of keeping, or I exaggerate the truth or leave part of the truth out. The idea is that you're compromising the truth, but people who are waiting on the Lord to bring justice, they're waiting on the Lord's return to bring mercy and compassion. They don't feel that they've got to do all of that themselves and manipulate things or get out of the hardship that they would bring upon themselves by just being honest and truthful and forthright. Their yes means yes every day of the week. Their no means no every day of the week. How many times have you had somebody ask you to come to something, to be at something? They're saying, hey, will you be at your nephew's birthday party? And you're thinking, and they're putting you under the pressure, and you're thinking, I'm not going to be there for that. Yeah, I'll be there. But the whole time you're thinking, I just want to get out of this situation right now. I don't want to have to say no now. I'll say yes, and then later I'll have something come up that prohibits me from being able to be there. And so the whole time for the next 2 weeks, you're thinking, what could possibly come up that will help me get out of that? And you've made a commitment, but you've broken that commitment. You made it never really intending to keep it at all. That happens when your yes is not yes and your no is not no. And in the midst of a situation, you are making commitments you have no real intention of keeping. This prohibition rules out exaggerating the truth as well in order to help get out of this difficult situation. Sometimes in a conflict where you're disagreeing with another person has one view and you have another, and the two of you are talking, and you're thinking, how can I convince them of my position and of what I'm trying to say? And you may exaggerate the truth, or you may use things that are not totally and completely true in order to sway them to your position. That's compromising the truth to try to get out of a difficult situation that you're in. A few years ago, we had a man in the church, not at this church, but another church, and I had a man in the church that didn't like something we were doing, and he came in to talk to me about it, and he was just saying, I don't agree with this, and he was sharing his opinion on it, and I was sharing mine, and we were talking, and he says, several people have come to me, he says, and told me they don't think this is the right thing to do either. And I was like, really? Several people. So I said, well, who are they? Well, now they told me not to say anything. I can't tell who they are. I said, but really, I mean, like, who are they? I got to know this, or tell them to come talk to me too. Like, if they won't come talk, I'm just going to assume it's just you. Anyway, we got down to it, and it basically boiled down to it was him, his wife, his best friend in the church, and his best friend's wife in the church, and that was it. Just 4 people. But there was an exaggeration of it to try to sway me to get out of the difficult situation of not being able to win it on his own. And so it was several people. And sometimes we do that. And James is saying, if you're really hanging in there waiting patiently on the Lord, you don't have to do all this. You don't have to try to be God and manipulate things. And you don't have to compromise the truth. You don't complain about your treatment. These are signs that you're waiting patiently in the face of suffering. This is the point that James encourages us to think through today. Be patient until the coming of the Lord. The return of the Lord could happen at any moment. It says the judge is standing at the door. We don't know when that's going to happen, but we know the return of Christ is imminent. There's nothing else left to be accomplished before Christ can return. And so when we go through suffering in this life, we're encouraged to wait patiently, not to try to bring justice about for ourselves. James doesn't write to his readers and say, fight for yourselves. He says, just wait. Wait patiently on the Lord. Be steadfast. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. It's at hand. The prophets were blessed because they remained steadfast. Job was blessed because he remained steadfast. God is compassionate. God is merciful. You don't need to complain about the way you're being treated versus somebody else, and you don't need to compromise the truth to get out of the difficult situation. Just, everybody say the word, wait. Wait. Just wait. Father, Lord, we love you. We thank you for this text today. It's a difficult thing to apply at times. We want to control things so much. We want to fight for justice for ourselves. We want to manipulate circumstances and the truth in order to make life easier for us. But you are faithful. You are compassionate. You are merciful. And you are a just judge. When you return, we will receive mercy. Your compassion will be evidenced to us, and we'll see your mercy and be granted that for any mistreatment or suffering we went through. And you'll settle all the scores. It's not up to us to do that. We don't settle the scores. We don't need to do that. We're trusting in you to do that. And so help us, Father, to just wait and to be patient and to trust in your faithfulness, to remain steadfast when the going gets tough, to hang in there. In Jesus' name, amen.